With the Edmonton Oilers all but assured of a playoff spot next month, the question becomes, what is their lineup going to look like come playoff time? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, a conversation about what's shaken out over the last few weeks and where the Oilers might go from here as far as constructing their lineup. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone that's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On today's show, we're going to walk through some emerging trends, patterns about the team over the last few weeks, have a little bit of a conversation about positive regression in our third segment, and then really try and build out what we think this playoff lineup is going to look like. And I'll be frank with you, my opinion on this is going to change at least 4 or 5 more times between now and the start of the playoffs, because the Oilers have an abundance of options. They have several players who are capable of playing both center and wing, which opens up possibilities. We're going to start today's show by talking about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins at center and the combination with Viktor Arvidsson and Vasily Podkolzin that's worked out very well in spurts this season. And we're going to go from there. So, tentatively speaking, we know that Connor Leon 1-2 down the middle. Then our conversation becomes, well, do we want to play Adam Henrique as our third line center, or do we want to play Ryan Nugent-Hopkins as our third line center? And based on the results we've gotten in spurts, and we should be fair, these are not huge sample sizes. We're talking about 90 minutes of 5-on-5 combined ice time. But in the minutes that Nuge has had with Arvidsson and with Podkolzin, they've got really nice underlying numbers, and they've outscored opponents 2-1 at a 2-1 rate, so 6-3. So they have a 66% goal share in their minutes. And 90 minutes is not a definitive sample. Generally speaking, I like twice as much as that. I would like to see about 200 minutes of 5-on-5 ice time for a line or a defensive pair before I make a definitive declaration about their quality and the composition as far as complementary pieces. But that number, I should say those numbers, give me a bit of perspective, because if we can build out our lineup in a certain way, and that's really the goal here, we want to build out our lineup in a way that puts our team in its best possible position. If you're watching on YouTube, I apologize for the jump cut there, but I wanted to grab my dry erase board to talk about this just purely because I think it's easier than me listing it out. So if you're listening to the podcast today, I highly encourage you to go watch over on YouTube, because it'll help you visualize what we're talking about here. So if we go with our 3 centers, we go McDavid, Draisaitl, Nugent-Hopkins down the middle. That gives us a new question. What do we do with Adam Henrique? Because we're not going to play Adam Henrique as our 4th line center. He is overqualified for that. He is too good of a hockey player for that. I think in that case, you would talk about potentially kicking Henrique out to McDavid's wing. And last year in the playoffs, they didn't play a ton together. I wrote this down in my notes. Where is it here? So last year in the playoffs, Adam Henrique played 61 minutes as Connor McDavid's left wing. In those 61 minutes, goals were 3-4-3 against. They had a 60% expected goal share. They had an 80% high danger share. So with that in mind, you're telling me that Henrique, who has always been an above average shooter for his NHL career, if I remember correctly, he's almost mid-teens. If I remember correctly, Adam Henrique is like 15 or 16% for his NHL career as a shooter, and putting that in a spot with Connor McDavid, and he's 15.2 for his NHL career as a shooter. So if we say we're going to put Henrique with McDavid, and then, well, we know Zach Hyman is staying with Connor McDavid. Okay, so if we put Arvidsson with Nuge, and then we put Podkolzin with Nuge, who does that leave us with? That leaves us with Jeff Skinner. That leaves us with Evander Kane. That leaves us with Trent Frederick. That's before we start getting into fourth line guys like Jones, like Corey Perry, like Kasperi Kapanen. So like I said at the outset, they have too many guys for too few spots. So no matter what, someone is going to end up on the outside looking in. We can tentatively say Corey Perry is going to be the fourth line right wing, based on the fact that whenever the Oilers have these end of game situations and they are chasing a goal, you very frequently see Corey Perry out there working the net front, and Perry is having a good season for his role. He doesn't play a lot of minutes. He's got a really high shooting percentage because he's in and around the net mouth. He scores enough goals that you can justify keeping him in the lineup, even if his underlying numbers aren't the most convincing. And this continues to build out our conversation. So we know Kris Knoblauch hasn't really liked the mix when he's played Jeff Skinner with Leon Draisaitl. If anything, and we're going to talk about this in our second segment, so I don't want to step too far ahead of myself here, but there has been enough in the last few weeks of McDavid and Skinner together before McDavid was injured that you could talk me into that tandem. And I have been very bullish on them as a combination all season long. And look, I know they came out of the gate really, really cold. I wrote it down here. So in the months of October and November, they were outscored 1-7, McDavid and Skinner together. Now it's better, but we'll talk more about that in our second segment, because I do think Jeff Skinner is an important component of what this recipe is going to look like. Now, I assume the Oilers want to play Evander Kane with Draisaitl. That's what I assume. I assume Evander Kane is going to play in that spot. But then what are we going to do with Jeff Skinner? And that's where this starts to get interesting, because you still have Skinner, you still have Trent Frederick. So if we say we want to go Trent Frederick in the Podkolzin spot or in the Nuge spot, and we want to kick him out wide, are we going to play Adam Henrique as our fourth line center? Are we going to play Adam Henrique as a winger? And that's really what it comes down to, because you're getting Trent Frederick, who's wearing 21 for the Oilers, if you didn't know, and you're getting Evander Kane in this lineup, whether you like it or not. And if that's what you're going down the left side with, where are you playing Jeff Skinner? Or if you're going to play Jeff Skinner on the first line left wing, where are you going to play Adam Henrique? Because you're probably not going to play him on the right with Draisaitl. You're not going to play him with Arvidsson, because you're not going to put him in the Arvidsson spot with Nuge, because then where are you going to put Arvidsson? Are you going to put Arvidsson up here? I suppose you could put Arvidsson with Draisaitl and Kane, but we have these good results. We have these good numbers for Nuge, Arvidsson, and Podkolzin. Excuse me. It took me a minute there to recall what we're talking about. Even I'm getting mixed up, and I'm looking at the lineup on my dry erase board here. The Oilers have an abundance of options. A lot of these options are pretty good. You know, a lot of teams would like to have a 13th or 14th forward as good as Kasperi Kapanen is. And that's really what this conversation becomes now. What do you want this lineup to be? We have an abundance of centers. Did you know Trent Frederick can play center too? So that's another consideration, where if we want to play Nuge on McDavid's wing no matter what, and we want to go Trent Frederick as our third line center, and you want to do more of a traditional checking third line where you did something like Frederick, Podkolzin, and maybe Arvidsson, maybe Henrique, maybe Connor Brown, and who I haven't even mentioned in Connor Brown. So again, the Oilers have a ton of options, and they need to find out what they want to do. And the challenge here is multifaceted in that you are going to drop Evander Kane and Trent Frederick into game one of the playoffs without either guy having played hockey in a while. In Evander Kane's case, since last June. In Trent Frederick's case, be over 2 months since he's played in a game by the time the playoffs start. That's a lot to ask of guys, especially if in Kane's case, he's going to go into your top six, or in Frederick's case, you assume he's probably going to kill penalties. You assume he might get a little bit of a look at center, if not on the wing. And there's just a lot of variables going on here. So the Oilers have a good problem here in that they have an abundance of options. And this week, as we talked about on yesterday's show, they get a little bit of an audition process to see how Nuge, Arvidsson, Henrique, Jeff Skinner, how those guys handle slightly larger workloads without Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid in the lineup. We are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Jeff Skinner of it all. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where you've got your team covered every day. Did you just realize your business needed to hire someone like yesterday? How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. When it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. We've all been in that spot where we need the right hire for our team like yesterday. The pressure's on, and every day without the right person is a major setback. That's exactly when Indeed sponsored jobs come in handy. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. Now, you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On Oilers as we are talking lineup decisions, as will become a recurring theme over the next few weeks as we build up to the postseason. Because generally speaking, you want to have this squared away already. You want to know who's playing with who, and then you have your one or two contingencies. Of course, it happens over the course of a playoff, especially if you go on a long and meaningful playoff run. You get to a conference final or a Stanley Cup final. You're going to rotate through combinations of forwards and defensive pairs just out of necessity, because sometimes you're just not going to have it that night, and you're going to experiment with something to try and get back in the game or to try something out to see what you're going to do for the next game. And that brings us to this conversation as far as Jeff Skinner. And I don't think there has been more of a litmus test amongst Oiler fans this season than the opinion on Jeff Skinner's role, his usage, and how often the Oilers are using him. And we talked about this all in depth a few weeks ago. We did an entire episode that was a deep dive on Jeff Skinner. But fundamentally, and I know I use fundamentally a lot, it's one of my favorite words. Fundamentally, Jeff Skinner is a top 6 player. Now, he is a top 6 player by virtue of NHL teams' insistence that you can't have skill in your bottom 6. And that's the first part of this conversation, because if it were up to me, I would be trying to roll 4 skill lines at all times. I would be rolling Jeff Skinner on the 3rd or 4th line. I would be playing them with someone else of a similar toolbox and trying to maximize the offensive output, because in the playoffs, the more low event hockey you try to play, the more variance you are introducing to the environment. The more you try and keep the game 2-1, 3-2, the more 1 or 2 plays are going to ultimately swing those games. And someone like Jeff Skinner is an offense only player, not offense first, offense only. And you have seen that consistently throughout Skinner's career. He's had a couple 30-goal seasons. He won a Calder Trophy all those years ago. This is an offensively gifted player. Playing him with Adam Henrique and Connor Brown is not maximizing what he's good at or getting the most out of him. And that's really the conundrum the Oilers face, because the Oilers clearly don't feel Skinner is capable of playing with McDavid or Draisaitl in real long durations because of the defensive implications of that. That if they trusted him, he would have been there already. And we know Kris Knoblauch has healthy scratched him a few times. And some of that is reasonable, that if you're not going to be able to play him on your first or second line, you feel like it's a waste to play a skill guy 11 minutes on the 4th line with Corey Perry and Max Jones or Derek Ryan. And that's really where this conversation kind of starts to take its shape, because over the last month, Skinner's had a really nice bounce back. The numbers, the underlying numbers have been a little bit better. Riding shotgun with McDavid, he's looked a little more comfortable, and that's helped. And look, anytime we're talking about Connor McDavid, we know we're talking about a great player. And I know I've definitely read in some national columns and heard on some national podcasts the whispers of what's wrong with McDavid? He's not having a great season. And look, by McDavid standards, yes, he could be a little bit better. But this is still over a point per game player. This is still somebody who is the engine driver of an entire team, where without him, the entire premise of this team and the organization falls apart. Can the Oilers get a little bit more out of him? Yes, I do think that's the case. Is it also possible that McDavid recognizes, hey, we're going to make the playoffs. I need to be as healthy and as locked in as I possibly can be come playoff time. So I'm not necessarily McDavid is pulling punches or holding back, but he's got to be ready. And you've heard him at various points coming into this season and going into last season say that 2 years ago, before they went out in the conference final, he worked too hard in the offseason. He came in a little bit underweight. He was a little overtired. And this past offseason, the year before they went to the cup final, he kind of channeled his energy a little bit better and had a little bit of a nagging injury at the start of the season. He's missed games here and there, but he's got a better understanding of what he and his body need. So while I don't think McDavid is pulling punches, I do think there's another gear for him to get to here, and that's exciting. That's a reason for optimism, and that's something I talked about pretty in depth on yesterday's show, the case for optimism. The Oilers, for all of the warts, for all of the complaints, they're still in a playoff spot. They still have a good record. Do they have a great record against playoff teams? No, but they have a good record. They are comfortably in a playoff spot, and they still have another gear or two they can get to. That is a cause for real optimism. And I would like to see Jeff Skinner play with Connor McDavid consistently. So if we were going to go by my idea, I would like to see that as the Oiler first line. I would like to see Skinner, McDavid, Hyman as the Oilers first line when we start the playoffs. From there, it does start to get a little bit hazy. So I assume we're going to be looking at Evander Kane, Draisaitl, and I would probably say Victor Arvidsson. And then it starts to get questionable, because do you want to do Nuge with Frederick and Connor Brown? You could tell me that's the Oilers' third line the first day of the playoffs, and I could believe that. But what are we doing with Adam Henrique in that case? And that's why I think, personally, you are probably going to see something along the lines of this. You are going to see Connor Brown there. You are going to see Matthias Janmark, who's 13, not 12, my bad. You're going to see Janmark down the middle as the fourth line center. You're going to see Corey Perry as the fourth line right wing. And then ultimately what it comes down to is, do you want Connor Brown here or do you want Henrique there? Because that's really it for me. I don't think Kapanen is getting a serious look as far as this. I don't think Derek Ryan is getting a look for this. Max Jones maybe is getting a look for this. But again, I don't know if I want to play Max Jones over Connor Brown or over Henrique or over Janmark or over Perry. Now, if you told me they wanted to rotate Perry in and out based on opponent, based on how he was feeling, to kind of load manage his minutes in the playoffs, I could see an argument for that, managing him a little bit more to get the most out of him. That's reasonable. But if the playoffs started tomorrow, this is pretty close to what I think it would be. This is what I would do. This is what I would do to start. Now, there are a lot of permutations off of this. We could see something entirely different, where we could see Trent Frederick in the Nuge spot, Nuge in the Skinner spot, Skinner in the Frederick spot. And then you start to get into the questions of who plays with who. And the Oilers have a ton of options, which is a good thing in theory. But as soon as it becomes overwhelming and it becomes difficult to make a decisive decision, then it becomes a challenge. We are going to take one more break on today's show. We're going to talk a little bit about regression in terms of shooting luck right after this. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. If you're like me, your morning has to start with a good cup of coffee. But I got tired of settling for grocery store brands that just weren't hacking it. That's why I turned to Trade. And let me tell you, Trade coffee, next level. Trade is the #1 specialty coffee marketplace in the United States, bringing you fresh coffee from over 50 of the country's top roasters. Their experts have taste tested thousands of coffees, curating over 450 amazing roasts. Whether you're new to coffee or know exactly what you like, they'll handpick the perfect match for you. Trade Coffee has a quick quiz where in under a minute they can match you with a roast that was fresh, smells incredible, and tastes even better. The subscription makes it so easy. No more last-minute grocery store runs or settling for whatever's in the pantry. And if you don't love your first bag, no worries. Trade will replace it for free until they get it just right. Right now, Trade is exclusively offering our listeners 40% off your first offer at drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. One more time, that's drinktrade, TRADE.com/lockedonnhl for 40% off your first order. drinktrade.com/lockedonnhl. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on today's edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of a back-to-back. And look, anytime you're without your two best players, taper your expectations. These are some good opponents as well. So I don't expect a whole lot. I was pleasantly surprised Saturday, the performance and the results against the Kraken. But right now, and I said this during February when the Oilers were in the doldrums of a 2-6 month. And when you are as leveraged on a small part of the team as the Oilers are, where Connor and Leon are expected to do so much of the heavy lifting. Again, you look at the score, the boxes, you look at the stats for this team this year, which is why I'm scrolling over to my notes here. Leon has 49, Connor has 26, Hyman has 25, Nuge has 20. After that, it's Corey Perry with 15, Jeff Skinner with 14, Evan Bouchard with 13, and Victor Arvidsson with 10. The scoring fall off in this group from the high end part to the middle to the bottom is massive. And the Oilers are built this way by design. They are built around their star players winning their minutes and winning their minutes decisively. And at large, Connor and Leon have lived up to the task. And when you look at what the Oilers have done in those minutes, and I'm going to click on over to my spreadsheet here because this is where I think it's important. So month by month, the Oilers have been pretty damn good. There's no equivocating here, other than the month of February where the Oilers really kind of had a hard time. The Oilers have been unequivocally good. In October, they struggled. That was their highest shooting percentage month of the entire season at 13.7%. November, not as bad, but still not great, 10.7. December and January, their two best months of the season. December, almost 13%, 12.6. January, 10.2. And then February, their lowest shooting percentage month of the entire season, 9.7. They went 2-6 in February. I don't think it's a coincidence that the team's lowest shooting percentage month also commiserated with the team's worst month in terms of wins and losses. And I do think you need to acknowledge the inherent variance involved when you have a team that's reliant on just two or three guys being real difference makers. Is that 1% shooting does not sound like a lot, but over the course of a month, 1% is consequential. For example, the Oilers had 246 shots on goal in the month of February. Scoring at 9.7 of them doesn't seem like that bad of a rate. So 2.46 times 0.097, 23 goals in 8 games, about 3 goals per game. But for example, let's say they did 246 shots on goal and they scored on 10% of them. We're talking about one more goal over the course of a month. Is one more goal that consequential in the span of 8 games? Not a whole lot. That might be the difference between winning and losing one game, but you get an understanding of how much variance there is. Of course, the goaltending component of this matters as well, as far as regression and that end and what the Oilers are getting in net and how much that matters on a night-to-night basis. Because if you're getting 905 goaltending, you don't need to be an 11 or 12% shooting percentage team. You can get by at 9.5, even 8.5, if you have good enough goaltending. But that's the way the Oilers are built. The Oilers are built to do the old school PDO. And when I first started doing hockey media about 10 years ago now, which is crazy to say, PDO was 100, which was shooting percentage 9, save percentage 910. That was what it was 10 years ago. Now it's gone the other way. Shooting is up to 10 and save percentage is down to 9. So you still get to 100, but the averages over the last handful of seasons have skewed in the other direction. Shooters are getting better. They're taking fewer shots because they're focusing on generating higher quality chances that are more likely to result in goals. And because of that, shooting percentage is up, save percentage is down. That's how we kind of formulate how lucky a team is. What percent of shots are going in and what percent of shots aren't going in against them. And the Oilers, by and large, when they have been right this year, they have shot 10, 11%. And they have the great underlying numbers. It's very infrequent for the Oilers to lose the shot share, to lose the expected goals, the high danger battle. It's very uncommon for the Oilers to play a game where they are thoroughly outplayed. Can they lose a game where they get unlucky? Yes. Have they gotten their butts kicked a few times in the last month or so? Yeah, of course. They've had some really ugly losses. But by and large, the Oilers are in most of their games. By and large, the Oilers control most of their games, where if they get the bounces, they win. And when you control the puck the majority of the game, the way the Oilers typically do, it's easier for you to get lucky. And as you absolutely heard from a coach at some point in your life listening to the show, if you ever played sports, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. The Oilers are a possession team that has had to reorganize how they play. You know, they don't have nearly as much foot speed as they've had in years past. So they aren't as able to create off of the rush, and they've had to create off of sustained offensive zone time, off of cycling. And because of that, it's kind of changed the composition of the team. You know, they're going to finish 28, 29 fewer goals than they scored last year. And some of that is environmental. It's a little bit harder to score this year than it was last year. It's a little bit harder to turn a scoring chance into a shot on goal than it was last year. And you have regression. You have McDavid, who's going to probably get to 30 goals, but it's not a shoe, and Hyman less than half of what he had last year. And that's really the conversation. How much of this is the Oilers specific versus how much of this is league wide and where the Oilers fit in a growing league wide trend? But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Real quick, if you forgot and you're watching over on YouTube, this is what I think the playoff lineup is going to look like if we were to make it right now. I think you're going Skinner, McDavid, Hyman. I think you're going Evander Kane, Draisaitl, Arvidsson, Trent Frederic, Nuge, Connor Brown, Henrique, Janmark, Corey Perry. If it were up to me, that's what I would be rolling with to start. You could convince me maybe play Henrique in the Connor Brown spot and Connor Brown in the Henrique spot, and maybe you worry about the handedness and the having three lefties on one line thing later on. But I do think there's an argument there that you want to have at least one right-handed shot on that third line. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or if you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for making Locked On Oilers your first listen of the day. For your second listen, go check out Locked On NHL, covering all of the biggest stories across the league with the local expertise from Locked On. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.